ModPo has come to Seattle, Washington, and in a few minutes we're going to go into a warmer, less windy hotel suite here to meet with Danny Snelson, who's going to talk with us about the Pine Woods Notebook of Craig Dworkin, and then the Pine Woods Notebook of Francis Pons, a Frenchman who wrote during World War II. And what's sort of Seattle-ish about this is that Craig Dworkin traveled with his family to the Cascade Mountain Range for a family trip in the fall one year, and he wrote the Pine Woods Notebook partly there. So we're really looking forward to the conversation. I'm here with Danny Snelson. We're in Seattle.
Hello.
It's good to see you. I'm a Philly guy. You're an LA guy, but we're in Seattle. It's great to see you.
Are.
And we're going to talk about two books. I mean, primarily, we're going to talk about Craig Dworkin's The Pine Woods Notebook. So we're really talking about Craig as a, let's say, post-expressionist.
Post-expressionist?
No, that's wrong. Craig as affiliated with conceptual projects among the poems that we talk about, contemporary poems. And this is a book-length poem, Pine Woods Notebook. But there's a very important, deep influence background here, and that is Francis Pons, who is French, and in a book of translated work called Mute Objects of Expression, actually a key phrase I'm going to ask you about in a second, we have the Pine Woods Notebook. So before we get started on talking about, substantive things, let's the two of us figure out what these two poems have to do with each other. So Pons, 1940, he is basically, he's traveling, he's on foot, leaving Nazi-dominated, I'm guessing Paris, dominated is actually a understatement, and he's meeting up with his family in the south of France, and he gets there, and he begins to write. So he's kind of in exile.
Yeah.
And what does he write? I mean, what's the quick answer to that?
I mean, he writes the pines. I mean, he does what Pons does so well, which is to take ordinary objects and just get deep into them, to write them until they become language.
Okay, so he does that. And there's no explicit reference to the political situation, which is totally remarkable when you think about it. Although there is a little bit. We'll get to it.
Yeah.
And Craig Dworkin, it's the same title. So now he's gone to the Cascades and the Wasatch. Do we say Wasatch or Wasatch?
Wasatch.
Wasatch.
Yeah.
So he's, I guess, on summer vacation, I'm guessing, or he's hiking.
Well, it's November, so that they're both in fall. So Pons is August, Craig is November, so it gives a different sense. And I think it's interesting to write about pines in the fall. Because their leaves don't turn. Right. And you're not writing about the maple, you're not writing about some,
Which is the traditional poetic thing. Oh, the year is ending, death, and all that stuff. You don't get that. Okay, so those are the two projects. Now, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to read you a couple of one's a quote from Pons, another is a description of Pons. So this is a Pons-centered comment, but what I'm going to ask you to do, and I'll help you, I promise, is to...
I'm ready.
Okay. Is to ask you how these 3 points have anything to do with both projects, right?
Okay.
So the first is about Pons, and you kind of said it. Pons believed that the root meanings of words pointed to the physical uniqueness of the object, right? So through precision of expression, and expression has to be a word endowed, through precision of expression, the object revives and survives in our sight. So the first point is about focus on the object. The second point is, again, Pons, instead of feeling or human ventures, this is a quote, I choose as subjects the most indifferent objects possible, where the guarantee of the need for expression appears to me instinctively to reside in the object's habitual mutism. Mutism as in mute. Mute objects of expression is the phrase that was used for the title of this book. Third point, and this is a summary of Pons, not a quote. Yeah, but I'll summarize them again. But this is really cool
this is
stuff.
Great. No, I like this. I'm
all right.
working on it.
So, Pons puts making a poem in opposition to comprehending, and he favors the latter. And he suggests that his language would always be reaching toward an understanding but never attains it fully. Okay, we know that part.
Yeah.
All right. So to summarize,
Okay.
focus on the object.
Yes.
Which is, takes us to the first months of modernism in poetry.
Yeah.
They were so into the object, and then they got into subjectivity and all that stuff. And modernism became associated with radical subjectivity, kind of a post-romanticism. But the first modernism was the object. Okay, so there's something, the physical uniqueness. The second is post-expression. Instead of feelings, I'm interested in indifferent objects, mutism. The object's habitual mutism. And the third point is a kind of post-pause modernism, not making a poem, not making, right? Not make it new or make anything.
Yeah.
But focus on understanding, comprehension, which suggests that you take a make it new style text, this Pine stuff, and you make it do the work of criticism and theory. So the comprehension is more important than, okay.
Yeah, cool.
Those are 3 points. How do these projects, and think about Craig as well as Pons, how do they
come together?
Yeah, how do those points obtain for this overall project?
Oh, okay. In both poets.
Yeah,
it's a good starting point.
Maybe focus on Dworkin. Does he abide by that physical uniqueness of the object? I think so, right?
Yeah, and I think actually I'll return to the first word I think you said was the word root. I think by accident. I think you're talking about the root of words
meanings,
and objects,
yeah.
root meanings, but roots of trees, and there's an intertwining
Root
of
is a pun.
the language throughout of the
Right.
object and the words that one uses to describe or circumvent or circumscribe those objects.
Right.
I think, to just take a step back and to get to these three things, we can start with, Ponch's most famous work, which is on the humble bar of soap, right? Just staring at a bar of soap and seeing what that soap can reveal. What does it do when it lathers? What does it do when it sits in the sill? And Craig, for his part, has written a similar kind of meditation on crystals. These cold, indifferent objects. To get to your second point, what could be more indifferent than a crystal on a desk or a bar of soap? Right. But the more you write them, the more you look at them, the more you write around them. I don't know if it's against expression. I think that they become expressive in all kinds of ways, and it's more about the expressiveness of the object in language, right?
When we say expression, though, it's a complicated term.
Yeah.
Of course, you're right. They wind up expressing, but we're using it in the cliche. My poem has to be about how I feel when I stand in a field of broken stalks and think about my losing you, my love. I feel I have to express myself.
Oh yeah.
The pines don't express themselves so much as they seep pitch. They do things in the wind that are sexual. We'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah, but they. I see in contradistinction to poems with expressive objects and expressive subjects here, there's a dramatic difference, and I think that's to get to some of the mutism or the indifference.
Right.
But I think, and to get to your third point around comprehending, that there's something about comprehension or just care. I think that in both of these works, there's just there's immense amounts of care and attentiveness. Yeah. And I think that when one is careful and attentive to an object, it begins. Its character comes out through language, right? Through these pages.
So there's a paradox here. Take Craig Dworkin's project. On one hand, you have intense focus on the object and a repeated effort to find words, unusual ones. In some cases, they don't seem to be in the dictionary.
I spent a lot of time with the OED for these three pages.
Right. Yeah. In fact, in a minute, I want to ask us both to look and find such words. But the point I'm making is that paradoxically, you get this incredible, intense focus on finding ways to use language to describe an object, but you get to a word like care. Right, you get one gets the feeling reading Craig, and certainly if you know the political background to Pons, you feel a desperate, urgent longing for this person to recover from the defeat of France, the rapid defeat of France, exile, reunion with his family, wandering for a month or two in the woods, writing with care about trees. It's an incredibly emotional and powerful thing. So care is how do we deal with that paradox, right? Some people think avant-garde, he's writing about pines, he's wandering in the woods, he's not telling us how he feels. What the hell, right?
Right.
What kind of rejoinder do you make to those people who think, oh, another one of these avant-garde, emotionally indifferent projects?
Yeah. And I think it's there in both works. I think, like, in Craig's work, that the care is very similar, and you can see it even just in the acknowledgments that have these, like, this beautiful line that he gives to his loved ones. I hope your paths are pinoculus? Pinoculus? I have no idea what that word is. Cool and shaded, right? So, I mean, there's something about sharing, like, there's also something about, like, sharing the pine woods with one's loved ones, right?
And with us, too, of course.
And with us, through the pages.
Yeah. All right, let's get to the thick of it, okay? Pine and pitch. So let's turn to Craig first. We'll get back to Ponch, but let's turn to Craig. So pine and pitch. Can you pull out a couple of examples of the way he works, and that's a great word for this, works pine and pitch in particular, and there's so many short eyes. Right.
So many short eyes.
You want to pick a few passages?
Well, and so, you know, we've been talking about the sort of, like, larger stakes, or the way that we might position these things together, or relationship to poetry.
Right.
But this book, I think, more than any of Craig's other books, is really it's in the sound of the language itself. Right. And I think that if we're going to talk about pitch and pines, and you know, I think. And this is a classic move. We have to start at the first line and the last, and then look at the last line, right?
The first line.
The pitch of the pines and the ridge line thickens bewitching.
So a lot of short eyes there.
Yeah. Right.
Can we just riff on pitch and pine before you quote some more? So pitch. So it is timber.
Yep.
R-E. Level of voice.
Timber.
Right? Timber. Right.
Uh-huh.
It is
You can't
the
help
tar.
but hear
the tar.
the homophones when reading this poem. And I think it puts you in a mental state where you hear homophones. Like I hear you say the word root when you say root. I hear timber as in a tree when you say timber as in voice.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so pitch does a lot of things. What else does it do? Pitch meaning to propose and to sell.
It's an angle, as in, like, the pitch of a.
Oh, yes, of course it is.
Field.
Right.
And that comes up in a number of ways.
Yeah.
It's also sap. I think
It's
importantly
sap,
is where
crucially.
this comes in, the black sap coming out of
Yeah,
of
okay.
the pine.
Pine?
Pine.
That's
is
a big
such
word,
Good
isn't it?
word. Yes, and it comes up in so many ways,
Right.
and so many different forms.
Let's riff on a few. One.
I mean, there's a tree.
Two.
And we're close to the Cascades. I think that maybe just
It's
through the
kind of
windows.
foggy out there.
It's a little
I mean,
foggy, but you know, you could almost see a pine from this window.
What body of water is that? Is that the Puget Sound?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, and then on the other side must be some pines.
Yeah, there's pines
Okay,
out there.
a lot of pines.
There are pines out there.
What's the great thing about pines, by the way,
What is
as
it?
opposed to maple and oak?
Oh, I don't know. What is it?
Well, no, pine trees. They don't drop their leaves.
Oh, yeah, of course. Well, that's what we were saying about Paul.
Evergreen.
Yeah. They're evergreens.
Yeah.
It's not.
It's an interesting move for a poet in the autumn.
Yeah. I thought we talked about that.
I know.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really interesting move, and they're and it's interesting to write about them in November.
Okay. What else is pine?
Yeah. It's to long, right? To pine
Yeah.
for. To pine.
Which is really, really great, powerful, emotional move on his part.
Yeah.
To take these, mute objects of expression and talk about pining.
And that's where I think that, coming back to expression, these pines pine. The pines are pining.
They really do, right?
Yeah.
I want to quote a couple lines. Bottom of 14, which is part of our excerpt. Firs risk scalenity. S-C-A-L-E-N-I-T-Y, not in the dictionary, not one that I could. Could you find that?
I've got it in the OED.
Okay,
yeah.
good. Tell us.
It's triangulation.
That makes sense.
Like a scalar.
Scale.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Firs risk.
Scalene, as in scalene, like a scalene
As in
triangle.
scalene.
Yeah.
Okay, scalene. Okay, got it. Firs risk scalenity with suspending talic scripts. T-A-L-I-Q. Excellent. What's the game we play? You have to get the Q. The Q is worth 10 points.
Oh, Scrabble?
Scrabble.
Oh, it's got a good cue. Yeah. Oh, that is a good word.
That's
to know.
a good
yeah,
word.
Yeah.
Excursus revokes talik. Excursus revokes
Which is a
heroic
kind of-
composure.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah.
But it's a kind of Persian medieval script.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
So
I looked it up.
Curvilinear scripts.
Yeah. And pines, rune, branches, rine, every pining, rex, R-E-C-K-S. I want you to respond to that language in a second, but I'm just going to throw in, I keep hearing Christian Buck's eunoia in there, and the reason is, there's only one reason, is that the language is so carefully worked over years, you get the feeling like every word choice is crucial, and everything gets so radically condensed. It feels like a project like that, even though otherwise it has nothing to do with.
Yeah.
All right, what's your reaction to this
and
language?
it's also that objects are doing things. Pines, rune, branches, rine. I think there's something about something similar that Christian shares.
Can you
I was actually
translate Pines rune?
Yeah, well, actually, I wanted to talk about Pines rune. Because the echo I hear there isn't Christian, but I hear, and it's actually a book that Craig taught me as a freshman.
You were his student?
I was his student as a freshman. And one of the first books was Ron Silliman's Chanting, the famous book written according to the Fibonacci sequence. It had a similar two-word line that has stuck with me through the years, which is Pine Koan.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Right?
That's brilliant.
So, and I was looking
You
for
think
that.
that's an influence
it's
here?
not. I didn't find it anywhere else, but when I saw Pine's rune, I think that's as close as it gets. So a cone is a kind of like Buddhist riddle, right?
I love that.
Pine cone, and he's also thinking of it. Pine cones also are written through the Fibonacci sequence, so there's something kind of beautiful about that. But here, rune, as opposed to cone, which sounds similar, is a spell. So the pines, a rune would be like, kind of incantation or a script that would cause a magical effect.
Isn't a rune something of a riddle? A problem to solve?
Yeah, a problem to solve, or but incantatory riddle, right? So the pines cast a spell. Branches, rine. So you've just changed one letter from rune to rhyme.
And what does rhyme mean as a verb?
I think it's I was trying to decipher.
Shouldn't have asked you a question I didn't know if you had the answer to.
No, I think it's like an affect,
R-I-N-E?
like it's to affect, to create like emotion. Right. So pines cast spells, branches affect. Every pining rex, and rex, R-E-C-K-S, is to pay heed. So every pining pays heed, like the pines themselves. So the pines are casting a spell, the branches are affecting, and then every pining, which is an interesting action, pays attention, right? So it's not just that Craig, the writer, is attentive to these pines. The pines are attentive themselves. They're doing things. They're casting spells. They're affecting you. They're attending to you.
Yes.
Which I think is beautiful.
So, and the pines are, not to put too fine a point on it, the pines are writing.
And the pines are writing.
They are doing writing in the sense, or they are creating scripts. Firs risk scalenity with suspending talic scripts. Now, or talic scripts. I think in part he is referring to the particular thing about fir bark, which kind of makes you think there's some kind of code, like a handwriting in there. In any case, it reminds me of Francis Pons saying that the pine woods, unlike a lot of forests of other trees, create a space, a room, an auditorium, he says. That's a great word for this, auditorium. More than others, and that's because they really put a lot of priority to the senile masts, the top, he calls them senile masts, that's the English translation. And they get rid of the lower dead branches so that you have a lot of room to move around. And I get that sense here in Craig, that he is able to get inside and read the pine woods, which is really a kind of a...
Well, and it's it's like deciphering a rune as well, right? That it's some kind of encrypted language. And there's all kinds of places where, and I'm not sure the handwriting, like there's all kinds of inscriptions that are happening. So there's soundings and there's inscriptions and they're intertwined in each of these lines, right? Incredibly dense to think about the forest like a forest of sound, like a very dense, populated series of rhymes and verbal plays. But then, there's all kinds of, I think on the first page at the bottom of 13, there's two kinds of writing. I think there's a kind of there's an audio writing where he refers to xylographic lock grooves.
I love that. Say that phrase again.
Xylographic lock grooves. Which xylographic would be a kind of like wood engraving, right?
Right.
And lock grooves, one thinks about like a record, right? Like a record that's stuck, which I think refers to the rings in the pine, right? So the pine's years, like if you cut a pine, like the lock groove would be a year.
Right. Arguably, and neither of us knows anything about the science of trees, or at least I don't.
Oh, I know nothing.
Okay.
I know nothing about trees.
Arguably, as the annuality occurs, as the ring making occurs, which is a kind of script, but you have to cut it to see it, you get what's called here, and Pons into it too, the unheard annual vibrations, which is to say, as the trees create more script, they accumulate sounds which are technically unheard, but pines do make noises. There are two kinds of noises. One is just the creaking and growing, which if you're really quiet in a pine woods you can hear. The other is the sighs, and I guess I want to turn to that now because Craig makes something of that. I've got a few notes here. The emotive sigh of the wind in the pine can be heard as a sexual reproduction made audible. Since the pine depends on wind, rather than insects or birds, which is true of a lot of the sexuality of trees. Otherwise, it's about moving things around. But they depend on the wind for pollination, right? So the erotic longing of pining meets the affective reflex of breath as they articulate the branching.
Yeah.
So what do you have? So this is kind of a sexy.
Well, and it's in a more colloquial sense, like one of the sexiest poetic sounds is the wind in the pines, right? I mean, this has become like one of our core cliches for a kind of
poetry,
poetic, beautiful sound.
Listen to the song,
the wind in the pines. And here, the wind is everywhere. The wind's distance incites the pines to hush. There's surface hiss. There's sibilates. Throughout, and I think that there's something about the way that the sound of the language, its depth of sibilance, like it's as though language is attempting to sound like the wind in the pines. Right? Somebody
who's steeped in traditional poetry, and even the first wave of romantic poetry, which is not traditional in the sense at the time it was radical, avant-garde, and revolutionary, but would say, wow, Danny and Al, you're kind of saying things about poetry I've always believed, which is that the best poetry is pure poetry, that poetry focuses on it, that it cares in every sense of that word about sound. Okay, and you probably would say, yeah, fine, that's good. This is going back to a certain root of poetry, no?
Yeah, but listen, in a certain sense, yes, it is doing that. But at the same time, there's nested sets of xylographic lock grooves, loose, slack dendril processions extending. Right, that's a very
not exactly
that's a Craig Dworkin
Wordsworth.
Line, right? I think there are a few poets that one has to look up more words, and that they're all purposeful. I think there's also a care on the level of diction. Yeah. Like every word is selected so carefully, and I think that was the frustrating thing. I think in my notes I was writing about how mad I was at you. What's so frustrating?
You were mad at me
for assigning this impossible text
because we don't assign these things.
Well, I guess I'm.
You love this text.
I love
and
this
are
so
happy
much.
to be talking about.
No. I say mad because I love it so much, right? Like each one of these, once you follow Craig down one of these etymological passages, right? When you're tracking these words to their roots, you discover so much in every word, and it's an impossible task to try to exhaust this poem. So there's unlike I think some traditional senses of poetry.
That was kind of almost a Charles Bernstein goofy question, like, why isn't this a traditional poem?
Yeah.
Oh, here are some reasons. Before we turn back to Pons, the difference between the two, they're same title. Although I think he uses a hyphen in Pinewoods, and I don't think Pons, at least in the translation. Pinewoods is a thing. I mean, Wallace Stevens has a poem, Bantams in Pinewoods. Pinewoods is a phrase. I just didn't. I didn't know it. I think I'm an upstate New York Catskills guy, and I say pine forest. That's what I say. Fir
Pine
is
forest.
actually balsam.
Really? Okay.
Balsam fir is my tree, not so much
Balsam
pine.
fir.
Yeah. Before we turn back to Pons only, the difference in the two projects is tremendous. I mean, Pons was, with all the pathos that one can imagine, walking away from his country into unoccupied France, reuniting with his family, he didn't bring any books, had a notebook, wrote in his notebook, and then walked in pine woods for a long time and wrote this poem because that's a powerful thing. You just want to do the politics or do the psychic longing that's involved in that.
Yeah.
Craig is hiking, I'm guessing. You know, he's out. He's Utah-based, and one of these is I believe, in northern Utah. One of these.
That's right. The Wasatch.
And the other is up near here.
Two families. I think I know he has family here as well. So I think they are like family locations.
Okay, so these are
the
so
Cascades
that's
and the
the
Wasatch.
common thing.
I think that there's something.
They're both family things, right?
Things. Yeah.
Right. But other than that, I mean, you know, one imagines. I mean, Craig is a very planful writer. He thinks about projects, but one imagines he got there and thought, well, look, Pons did it, I can do it. Let me start. Let's see what happens, right? What are the differences? You know, you come to the Pine Woods Notebook and you think that's an optional, voluntary project for a poem, whereas with Pons, you almost feel like he had to do it to remain psychically alive.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on motive?
Well, in some ways, I'd like to almost read this as. This is a perverse reading, but I'd like to read it as scholarship on Pons in some ways, right? Like it's not just after Pons, but I think it's like after in the sense that he's like chasing Pons, right? And I think that in some of the projects that Craig has done, there's a way in which he addresses literary object in his own style, in his own method, as a way to sort of say something or engage with that text, right? And there's another kind of care and intimacy there. And I can't say how careful this is, but I'm thinking, of his work where he writes through 1,000 Plateaus, for example. There's also the Crystal Text, which is after Clark Coolidge, which is not at all like Clark Coolidge's Crystal Text, but does its own kind of thing as, I think, a kind of like, a way of approaching or a way of producing a kind of literary intimacy.
So a critical secondary take rather than a standard scholarly article. And also it has a relation, the two projects have a relation of, one comes first, other comes second. One is kind of totally crazily original, and the other is an homage.
Yeah.
Right. So there is that.
Yeah, and crazy original as well. And I think it's another one, like the etymological passages that are inexhaustible. I think that there's also this dense network of intertextual references, which is inexhaustible, right? So every time that pine or wood or roots or sheets of paper or handwriting comes up in Pons, it's also in Craig's text, and I like to think that there's all these connections that we're always going to be missing.
Right.
But that those connections, there's this dense heft to them that's there.
Well, I want to turn back to Pons, and we're getting toward wrapping up. Although we'll feel at the end of this conversation that
we didn't say anything.
Right, there's so much more to say. Well, we got a little while to go. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you from the Pons.
Great.
I'm reading from the Addenda, which is a commentary, just a brief commentary, and then an excerpt from an August 6th, 1940. You're going to struggle to find it, so I guess you'll just have to listen, because I'm really only making one point through Pons. Okay. Here's the beginning of the Addenda. The preceding text, and there's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek here, a little bit, I think. The preceding text was written beginning August 7th, 1940, in a wood near La Souchère, a hamlet in the Haute-Loire, where the author, after a month and a half of exodus along the roads of France, had just been reunited with his family. We've talked about this. Okay. The author remained in La Souchère for almost 2 months, but in the same pocket notebook, which constituted his only stock of paper at the time, nothing, italicized, was written but the above text, and the few notes that follow, including this one, entered as addenda on the dates indicated. Okay, here's one of the addenda. August 6th. What I might like to read, and that's in quotes, I think quoting from the poem, colon, that could be the title, the definition. of what I'll write. Deprived of all reading material for several weeks and months, I think my copy isn't very good. I think in beginning, I'm beginning to feel like reading. Sorry, I have a bad copy. Deprived of all reading material for several weeks and months, I'm beginning to feel like reading. And then one more. Well then, it's what I'd like to read that I'll have to write. But I'm probing my inner self a bit more attentively. I find it's not only reading that I'm wanting, but also painting and music. So I must write in a way that will satisfy this amalgam of needs. Now, I think this really applies to the poems, but also to Craig, and I'd love for you to talk specifically about these texts, but generally, you know, Danny Snelson thinking about this. How exciting is it to create a text that comes from the desire to read, and the text you want to read is the one you are writing?
Yeah.
That is really cool. Can you say why that's so cool?
I mean, isn't that what every poet should do, right?
I think so,
write
right?
the text that you want to read.
Right.
And I can see Craig as a reader. Like so you know, Craig is not just a poet, but he's also a scholar, and he has a particular way of reading etymological roots. He has a particular way of reading poets that have these dense constructions and these archaic words and the way that they connect to different things. And so of course in the poetry that's everywhere, right?
Yes.
So that's exactly, so you can imagine him becoming lost in the forest of a dictionary through his own poem, which I think is a really quite beautiful thing.
Say more. You know, the merge of reading and writing, which, you know, for so long, I think I'm old enough to have been trained to, you know, I'm going to teach you how to read, do some reading, read.
Yeah.
Don't think about writing. Who the hell are you to think about writing? And then writing becomes, you know, this composition or secondary critical. And one of the great revolutions of the last 50 years and possibly 100 years and arguably, you know, since 1795 or whatever, has been the bringing together of those two activities. So say more about reading and its relation to writing and its relation to reading.
Yeah, it would be hard to. I think it'd be hard to break them apart, right? Like, as two separate activities, right? And to write something of this density and with these like archaicisms, like mersatorials, which are seabirds, apparently. My dictionary tells me. But even just to I imagine to write this, one must constantly be reading. Like you can feel or you can get the sense that there's a deep amount of research that's going on in the background, and so I imagine quite a bit more reading than writing to produce each one of these words. Right.
So writing is reading. Now,
but
is reading writing?
Is reading? Yeah, of course. Yes. Yeah, and I think that there's also to answer your question. But I think there's a way also in which and this is to come out of the after Pons or from this tradition is to read the environment, right? So the objects themselves become texts that one is reading. So there are, you know, that you read everything from the silence to the sound of the wind to the tree, and that each of those things are not just, you're not writing it with some kind of divine inspiration, but you are listening to and writing through these objects.
Yes. Yeah. So when John Ashbery thought it was really cool to write about Guadalajara in his office in New York, really great, very innovative idea, saying basically that experience isn't at all that it's cracked up to be. Why do I don't need experience in order to do this, because writing is always inventing, following Wallace Stevens, you know, who never left Hartford, you know, and writes about Tennessee. That's not quite true, but and it's not true of Ashbery, who traveled a lot, but he certainly didn't go to Guadalajara. Okay. What is Craig and Pons, but Craig in particular, because he comes after Ashbery, is saying to that? I think he's saying you got to go to the Cascades.
I think so. Yeah, and I think that's very much in Pons as well. Like you sit in front of the bar of soap and write about the soap and listen to it and hear what it has to say to you. And I think that there's certain kinds of close listening to these objects that come across in the poem in a way that it's not some fantastical set of pines, it's not some abstract set of etymological plays that are divorced from the objects themselves. Like you can hear the pines, like you can hear the crunch of hiking boots through the Wasatch and the Cascades. Yeah.
If you go and you listen hard, then you accomplish that thing that Pons was pining for, which is a kind of writing that will also do some work of painting and music, right?
Yeah.
I'm in exile. I don't have access to the symphony. I don't have access to the Louvre, but I have Pines. So what can I make that will give me my reading pleasure, my listening pleasure, my visual pleasure? I think I'll go and read the Pines.
Yeah, and I think that there's also a way in which to make those pines sing, like they're already singing, but then through the poems to augment the song or to join in that chorus, and to thus render the natural environment as something like an aesthetic object.
So what the hell is wrong with us that I came all the way across the continent?
We should be out in the forest.
I was going to say, and we're having conversation about the Pines within probably a 15-minute drive in a hotel suite. But at least we came close.
Well, the transportative power of poetry is that we don't need to go to the Pines because they're right here.
They're
right here in this book for us.
No, that can't be. No, I really do feel, I'm going to give you the final word here after I say this somewhat emotional thing, which is that, reading both of these, the Pons was a revelation for me. But, I had read the Dworkin before, but reading it to prepare for this conversation, it made me pine for quiet contact, in almost a Waldensian sense of seeing if there's a new breath, a freshness, pine fresh, in this kind of encounter with what's the line? The mute object of expression.
Yeah.
There's always going to be expression that comes out. You got to start with the idea that it's a mute object and then let it do its expressing. All right, that's my final thought. What's your final thought?
I'll bridge on that. I grew up along the Wasatch. I grew up hiking in these same. I'm from northern Utah. Small town in northern Utah. Did a lot of hiking in these same mountains with these same pines, and there's something so intimately familiar about them. And one of the things that I found really familiar is every time I'd stop to look up one of these words, it felt like I could remember being a kid hiking through the pines and then seeing some little bug or some little thing that you have to get in close and investigate.
Yeah.
And all these little mysteries. This poem I think produces the same set of wonder at all the little mysteries that one has when one's on a hike, right? When you're really attending to your environment and trying to decipher these very indecipherable objects, these sort of magical objects.
That's cool. So we need to get our rain slickers because it's raining as usual.
Let's do it.
Great. Danny, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Al.